And now it's a real honor to present this next panel, which is we're going to be discussing the spirit of democratic capitalism in our businesses. And so our first panelist will be Nathan Bond. Nathan is the former president of the Rifle Paper Company, the founder of the Rifle Paper Company, a company which grew so quickly that it was called one of the fastest growing companies in the United States. He was nominated in 2015 by Forbes magazine to be one of the 30 under 30 most game-changing entrepreneurs, young game-changing entrepreneurs in the United States. He is a board member of the Acton Institute, of Magdalen College, and many other boards. And great to have you with us today, Nathan. Second panelist is Oren Cass, and Oren's, of course, no stranger to us here at Napa. In fact, his last talk was brilliant. Oren is now the president of American Compass. Prior to that time, he was a member of Bain & Company, and while he was a member of Bain and working there, he managed to pursue a Juris Doctor at Harvard University, and while he was at Harvard University, they elected him vice president of the Law Review, and then while he was doing all of that, he managed to become appointed to the domestic policy advisor for Mitt Romney's presidential election campaign. So he's a real slacker. And of course, he actually moved on to work with the Manhattan Institute, writing many of these very thick policy papers that come out from there. And of course, he's the author of many articles and a great book called The Once and Future Worker. Our third panelist today, Jim Otteson, a wonderful ethicist from Notre Dame. He's a professor of business ethics at Notre Dame University, heads up the ethical leadership program at Notre Dame University, and has written two wonderful books, Honorable Business and The 7 Deadly Economic Sins. I got to read that one to complement my own education. And furthermore, he has written many articles, of course, as well, and in his professional field in business ethics. Great to have Oren and Jim with us too. And of course, no stranger, Andreas Widmer is going to be our moderator for this panel, always with the good questions. And Andreas is associate professor of entrepreneurship there at Busch School of Business at Catholic University of America, and heads up the principled entrepreneurship program at Catholic University. He truly was a director or a board member of multiple NGOs, international NGOs and nonprofits before he came to the Busch School. I think most people recognize him as the one who wrote that book, The CEO and the Pope, where he describes a really long, wonderful relationship with St. John Paul II, which started when Andreas was a Swiss guard there at the Vatican. So take it away, Andreas. It sounds like a fantastic panel for our topic today of bringing the spirit of democratic capitalism to our businesses.
Thank you, Father, for the kind introduction. Hi, everybody. First meeting after lunch. I want to point out, did you see the beautiful painting that we have here? This is actually in our offices at Catholic University at the Ciocca Center, at the Entrepreneurship Center. This is Igor Babailov's trial painting that he did for the portrait that was made for Michael. And he would be tickled to be here, not only that this is in Manhattan, but maybe we can have a couple of Manhattans tonight, because this is what Michael would have just loved. The other thing I just want to share with you is, Fred and I, where is he? We started the Entrepreneurship Center, the Ciocca Center, and our very first hire was Michael Novak. And he was 80 years old, young, as he would say at the time, and lived down in Ave Maria. And we talked with him, and he says, hey, I'm bored in retirement. I have a lot more to say, and I want to come back to DC. And we brought him back, and he taught for the last 3 years of his life at Catholic University, and he absolutely had a great time, but the best time was had, and the most learning was done by the students. Today I'd like to focus on, the three-legged stool, it's sometimes called. It's also these 3 interlocking circles. He called it a triune framework: cultural, political, economic. There's different ways he described it, but one of the things he talked about is that each one, and this is what I want to draw a little bit on, each one of these circles, these spheres, has its own task, its own work, and it has to be in productive tension with the other systems. This is literally what he's writing. He says that actually the role of each of these, by definition, is to create problems for the other 2. And he calls it a desirable tension. And here's what I quote now: "From the stream of sparks flowing from their contact, the overall system derives its energy for progress and its capacities for internal correction. It's a system intended to constitute a continuing revolution." These 3 things, they are made almost like the three parts of government that are checks and balances, that if each one works well, they actually keep control or keep the other one honest. It's not, something is wrong when one of them takes over too much, then the spirit of democratic capitalism is in danger. And so what I would like to ask our panel today, specifically from the perspective of the economy, the business circle, how is this working today? How has it been working in the past? I'll let you choose the exact focus you want to take. But within the economic system, in the context of so many companies practicing political activism and promoting certain morals by some corporations and businesses to be almost like imposing a certain morality, are they going beyond what Novak called a healthy tension? Or is this part of the sparks that must fly for democratic capitalism to work? Oren, can I ask you to give us some ideas about this first?
Sure. Well, thank you very much for having me. I've been looking forward to this conference ever since having the chance to attend last year. So really delighted to be back and talking about this topic, which I think is such an interesting one, because I think there's a tension. Certainly Novak likes talking about these tensions. I think there's a tension also in how Novak speaks or writes about the role of business leaders. And it's a tension that business leaders feel quite acutely, which is the question of what is supposed to constrain their behavior. There's a sort of radical free market view that would say, just focus on profit, don't worry about everything else, and all will work out. Novak gestures at that a few times, but for the most part, I think recognizes that's not what a healthy democratic capitalism looks like. And so in some places, he writes about all of the other values and the pressure coming from the moral and cultural sphere that should lead business leaders to behave in a moral way. And to the extent that we as business leaders do that, it might seem like the problem is solved. The problem, I think, looking out at the world is that business leaders don't necessarily do that, and that even feeling as a group of very ethical or moral business leaders, it's important to recognize that across the economy, that constraint might not be sufficient. And so Novak then also talks about the other sorts of constraints that are going to act on business leaders. And the 2 that I think are most interesting and worth contemplating, one is labor unions. And it's interesting, he talks about the chief social inventions of democratic capitalism, he says, are the business corporation and the free labor union. And the union is an institution that is designed specifically to constrain what business leaders can do and what choices they can make. And then the other thing that he says, speaking about the legitimate role that the political system plays, he specifically identifies the regulation of international trade. So in how business leaders are going to interact with the rest of the world, he also sees the need for a constraint from outside. And so I think that, casually read, Novak can seem to be saying democratic capitalism works when, within the economic sphere, business leaders simply focus on building great businesses and pursuing profit. But I think ultimately the way that he sees those tensions operating is that actually it is both the internal constraints that great business leaders put on themselves, but just as much constraints coming from elsewhere in the system that are necessary to make capitalism actually work well and channel that entrepreneurial spirit toward the public good.
Nathan, do you agree with that? Do you want to add anything on this?
I would say, in response to what you were asking, Andreas, when it comes to whether or not businesses have overextended themselves into the moral and the political sphere, the problem that I see is that business leaders are poorly formed in the first place. So it's not so much that they're, you were saying, Oren, we have a room, we hope, of ethical business leaders. I think a lot of these people see themselves as ethical too, and they're actually making an effort to be ethical, but it's disordered enough that they really don't know which way is up, and it causes problems. So for me, it's a little bit different than, I'm not responding directly to what Oren was talking about on labor unions and everything else, but that's what comes to my mind when you ask that question.
Yeah. So, Jim, you actually wrote books about morality in business and so on. Do you think this is, how do you stand with this? Is this something that comes from the cultural side and business has nothing to do with it, or does it have to be homegrown?
Well, I do like this point that that there is some lack of formation among business leaders. I mean, I'm a philosopher by training. My PhD is in philosophy, and I teach in a business school. I'm the only philosophy PhD that teaches in the business school at Notre Dame, one of very few at any business school in the country. But I will mention something that I found interesting when I was first asked to teach a class in business ethics, this field called business ethics, which is a field. It has journals, and there are people who specialize in business ethics. I did a little bit of research in trying to figure out what other people teach when they teach these business ethics courses. So I took a look at dozens and then hundreds of syllabi that were used in other places, other institutions. And I came to a couple of conclusions. One was that there was no real consensus about what these courses were supposed to be about. They were all over the place, very different kinds of courses. So this maybe goes a little bit to the question of what kind of formation is taking place. But the other conclusion I came to was there did seem to be a couple of underlying currents, and one of them was that, and in fact, I'll quote a famous endowed chair holder at another institution, not my own, another institution. This is what he told me he wants students to come out of his business ethics courses with. So I asked him, I talked with him, he's a very famous person, and I said, what would you like, if you could put it in one sentence? And he said, what I want students to understand is that business ethics is compliance plus nice. Okay. So legal compliance, in other words, and just be nice about it. Well, that's not a very inspiring vision. Even if that's true, it seems like we really ought to be able to come up with something that speaks to the human condition and the human situation in a deeper way than just legal compliance plus smiling and saying thank you, as important as I think those things may be. But I'll mention one other thing. When I first started teaching business ethics, one thing that surprised me about students in those courses is how many of them were embarrassed and even defensive about the fact that they were studying business. So many of them would not tell their colleagues, their other students, that they were studying finance, for example. So that was one of the worst. They were embarrassed. They might be studying finance, and maybe they have some idea about what they'd like to do one day in finance. But they wouldn't tell their friends that they were studying finance. They would say something like, I'm studying psychology, I guess, which, I don't know, that sounds less ominous. Well, that's something I think is, that's a problem. And I have said that to my students. If you're studying something and contemplating perhaps dedicating your life to something, it better be something you can be proud of. And if it's not, then maybe you need to rethink what you're doing. And I'll just give an analogy. Why are students embarrassed by that? Well, one reason I think is probably because of what the larger culture suggests. I mean, who's the villain in every Hollywood movie? It's the CEO of some international corporation. And they know that many of their friends and colleagues have similar views about business and business people. But I'll leave you maybe with this analogy that I asked, and I've now introduced it to every class I teach right at the beginning of the first day. Consider these two and compare these two professions, medicine and business. So think about medicine and business. In both medicine and business, you have specialties, subspecialties. In both cases, in order to be successful, you're going to have to learn a lot of technical knowledge. You're probably going to have some experience. And in both cases, if you are successful, you might make a lot of money. So in all those ways, and others perhaps, but at least in those ways, those two disciplines, those two professions are similar. But consider how differently those two professions are viewed by the wider culture. So nobody says to the medical doctor, well, now that you've made your money, you need to give back to society. But they say that to the business person, don't they? And isn't that interesting? I mean, you've all heard that, I'm sure, this give back to society. Have you ever thought about what that means when somebody says that? Notice they don't say business people should give. You should give back. Well, I mean, when your mother told you as a child you need to give that back, what does that mean you did? You stole something, you took something that didn't belong to you. All of this is to say that I think we face a real challenge when we're trying to think about how we want students who genuinely are committed to leading a life that matters. They want to have a purpose in life. Making money is great, but they understand, I think, for many of them, that that's going to be a byproduct at best. It's maybe a means to the end, but it's certainly not the end. How do we integrate business in a market economy into this idea of having a purpose in life? This is something that I think is for professors, and maybe also for people who are practitioners. And by the way, I'm very glad that we have a practitioner on the panel, because it's because of people like that I get to just talk about it. It's nice that there are people actually doing it. But I think we really need to think hard about what it means to integrate a sense of moral purpose in life, and maybe even, dare I say, a calling, and this does bring us back to Novak's, but a calling in business.
If I could just add, a little bit to that, I think I want to back up what you're saying. In the last decade, there's been this sort of social entrepreneurship movement, and the concept behind it is basically we're doing business stuff and we're doing good stuff too, right? Which I think misses the point that obviously if you're doing any business worth doing, following basic standards of virtue, your business already is offering some sort of social good already, right? It doesn't need this plus. And I think it's some of that sort of bias. I mean, trust me. I mean, I would meet with startup companies sometimes, and they would be embarrassed to make a profit. They would want to have a company without profit. These are like conversations I have kind of regularly with other business people. It's shocking, and I think that bias is part of what's contributing a little bit to a lot of the sort of ideological stuff that's getting snuck in to company HR policies, marketing, and messaging, because we have to be more, and we have to bring our ideology into the business to make the business good. So I think, I'm not saying that's the only phenomenon. There's many things happening here, but I do think that's part of it. We're missing that business is
It's an underlying
itself
understanding that the ethos of business is bad, right? Can we agree that that's the underlying understanding? So Wolf of Wall Street, all of that. Now, of course, if you go all the way back to Scrooge and everything, that may have always been there with Dickens and all of that. Oren, do you think that this was the same situation when Novak wrote this? Because then he followed up this book with Business as a Calling, which is actually one of the missions of our business school. Was it a problem back then? Has it gotten worse? And then I'd like to talk about where did this ethos come from? Who were these people who left their morals behind and started to become the wolf of Wall Street? I mean, that happened in the 80s, by the way. So do you have an opinion on that?
Yeah, I do think it's gotten a lot worse, and it's funny, I usually kind of pick the 1984, 1985 as the starting point. So Novak would be right there writing just before it, and I think maybe one way to understand where the the skepticism in that ethos comes from is looking at Milton Friedman. Because there are sort of two sides to Friedman. On the one hand, in Free to Choose, and Novak quotes him on this, Friedman sort of talks in much the way Novak does about the fact that self-interest doesn't mean narrow profit, it means a broader sense of values and so forth. But of course, maybe the thing Friedman is best known for is in the business world is his essay in the New York Times about how the social responsibility of businesses is to generate profit. And in that case, speaking about the obligation of management to shareholders, he actually says the opposite of what he says in Free to Choose. In his essay on the social responsibility of business, he specifically says that the obligation of management is to conduct the business in accordance with ownership's desires, which generally will be to make as much money as possible. And so I think when the tension that we feel and where this ethos comes from is a real difference between your typical business person in the classical sense, the person running Rifle Paper Company who has the autonomy to build a business that does reflect their virtues, as opposed to the modern corporation that is technically owned by a set of shareholders who are anonymous. Increasingly, as the decades since the 80s have passed, it's not even clear who the shareholder is, if it's through a passive index fund and it's held through these layers, or if it's a sovereign wealth fund. 40% of US public equities at this point are held by foreigners. And so I think we face a situation where much of what we think of as the business world is in fact divorced from the kind of virtue-based business that we value. And it's not clear how to get it back. It's not clear who is actually the one with the authority to stand up and say, no, that's not what I want here. And then finance is just the extreme instance of it. I mean, Wolf of Wall Street is a great movie in part because it's based on how that firm actually conducted itself. And I think there's no shortage of examples in the finance industry of people who are generating a lot of profit in ways that don't create a lot of value. And so I think that's where, to Jim's point about embarrassment about studying finance, there are many ways to very virtuously be a financial professional. There are many ways to do it not especially virtuously. And so I think as the economy has developed, financialized, globalized, we find the day-to-day practice more and more removed from the sort of virtue-based business that we do have as the ideal and that we aspire to.
Can I ask you a really quick question, Oren?
Yeah.
How do you think sound money fits into this? Meaning, I hear you on the anonymous shareholder problem, and I obviously could foresee how that affects company culture. It's not clear to me that it necessarily is bad, for sure, but I could see potential issues. But it seems to me you have unprecedented easy money policies for the past, my entire adult life. Mm-hmm. Creates lots of moral hazard. I think there was a panel earlier where this was discussed a little bit. How much do you think that's factoring into this problem?
I think it's definitely part of the problem. If you look at sort of the drivers of particularly the kind of explosion of Wall Street as an industry unto itself, the easy money of the last kind of 10 to 15 years is obviously an element. That being said, if you look at the data on when Wall Street and the financial sector as a segment of the economy exploded, it predates that. So kind of peak, financial sector as a share of corporate profits, talented business people heading to Wall Street, is probably 2000, 2001. And so I think the monetary policy has made things worse, but there's something either in the structure of the economy or the culture and the moral cultural system that was already driving this between when Novak wrote and when, frankly, a lot of that kind of behavior led to the financial crisis.
I think I might locate the problem a little bit earlier than the mid-1980s. I would locate it probably with the expulsion from the Garden of Eden. Greed has been one of the 7 deadly sins for a very long time, and for good reason. I don't think there's anything particularly new. What I do think is new, and the kinds of things you're talking about, are the vehicles through which people can express and represent their greed and other vices. That's certainly true, and that has changed. But I think these are very old vices. And one thing that I think business ethics and business education, I mean, I'm a professor, but business education would do well is to consider the extent to which there is an anthropology to human beings. And what that anthropology actually is. What are human beings? And if we have a sense, if we are able to spend some time thinking about how are human beings constructed. So, for example, we like to talk about human dignity. This is one of our favorite phrases. It's one of my favorite phrases. I like to talk about it a lot. Well, why do we have dignity? Okay. Everybody likes to say we human beings have dignity, and you don't have to be a Catholic, you don't have to be a Christian, you don't have to be an American to say that human beings have dignity. We like to talk about dignity. Let's talk about why human beings have dignity. And the minute you begin talking about that, you start acknowledging, just think about all the assumptions that are behind that. There is such a thing as human nature. There is a world that human beings are part of. Maybe we can learn about our nature. We can learn about the world. Maybe there are some things that are true about that nature, which means there are some things potentially that are false about that nature. That all of a sudden begins a way of thinking about my place, my identity, my connection to other human beings. And if you're in a Christian or a Catholic perspective or environment like Notre Dame, where I am, you can think about your relationship to God and to the other aspects of nature. That all of that suddenly enables us to make sense of our experience and give, I think, some kind of parameters for what we want to do with our lives that we wouldn't otherwise have. So I think greed is a very old vice. I think selfishness is a very old vice. These are things that are very old. They're not new. But what we can do, and I think what I like to aspire to think we could do, is figure out a way to channel the vices that we have, understand them as vices, and then begin to aspire to develop virtues in all walks of our life and integrate that in a way that, including in our professional life. I mean, we can't just be virtuous in the evenings and on the weekends. Virtue is something that extends itself throughout our entire lives, including our professional lives and our family lives. Business education, I think, should embrace that and orient students towards thinking about exactly that. My professional life in finance or whatever field I'm going to go into is going to be an expression of the good, not just for me, but for my family and my community, my relationship to others, ultimately my relationship to God.
Who in this system, and in Novak, but then also you personally with your opinion, whose business is it to form our morality? Is it business's business to form its morality? Who's in the business of forming morality? Because aren't we saying that that's what's lacking?
To me, it seems that's the main issue from where I'm coming from. Obviously, I think it's the cultural sphere, the family, mediated institutions, the church, other, and the schools. And I would say on all three fronts, it looks pretty bad, to be perfectly honest.
And do you agree with this, Oren?
Yeah, the one thing, so I was going to exactly make the same point, starting with family and mediating institutions. I think the one thing I would add is it's really important to distinguish immorality from amorality. Mm-hmm. Because
You mean amoral or amoral?
All one word, amorality.
Yeah, amoral,
yes,
yeah.
Thank you. The problem, to the extent we have one in the business world, I don't think is immorality, or at least I don't think it's any more of a problem than it would have been at any time in history. I think the problem that we have is one of amorality, which is that even people who might be very well-formed come to the business world and face a set of incentives that do not reward them living their virtue in their business. And I think the way Jim made the point about channeling sins is exactly right, that the incredible power of capitalism is it takes self-interest, including greed, and says the best way to fulfill that is by, in fact, serving others productively. And that's when the system works well. And I think what we've seen in a lot of the ways we're talking about is just is the release of those channels so that things are able to spill into a lot of places that can make a mess.
Yeah, I would. I think that's right, and I would add one other thing. This is sort of going back to what you're mentioning about Milton Friedman. I think one of the mistakes that we often make. I don't know that I would blame Milton Friedman for this, but lots of people associate this idea with Milton Friedman. That if an association or a partnership or a transaction is mutually voluntary, then there's nothing else to be asked about it. That's a mistake, and I think that's also false. There are plenty of mutually voluntary activities that are bad. So the fact that that something is mutually voluntary, I think, is necessary, but certainly not sufficient. And one of the strong lessons, I think students and young people get from our culture is that there's no further moral judgment to be invoked. There's no further moral standard to be even considered beyond, well, was it consensual? So one of the things that goes on in a market economy, and one of the defenses of a market economy, is that, well, you're giving expression to people's freedom to choose. Great, yes, that's true, and that is the generator of all sorts of goods, and I do not want, and I think this is a different kind of mistake, but I don't want us to not recognize that the levels of wealth and prosperity that we enjoy today have been enjoyed by precisely no human beings in the past. So we are blessed to be living at a time when there's more wealth and prosperity than there has ever been in the history of the world. And after the antidote to poverty, after all, is not getting comfortable amidst your poverty. That's not what we want. What we want is prosperity. So that is the antidote to poverty. So all of that is very important. I think we should recognize that. On the other hand, just because somebody's willing to buy a product from you doesn't mean you should be selling it. And that means that you need to exercise some judgment too. So one way to think about this, and maybe this could lead us once again back to Novak, is I need to be, if I'm going into business, if I'm selling a product, I need to be willing to, in good faith, in all honesty, and think about this, here's how I tell it my students. You know, one day you're going to go before your maker, and he's going to ask you. You need to be able to say, no, I think what I was doing was actually improving other people's lives. I was using my talents, my treasure, my time to make other people's lives better. So voluntary is part of it, but among the various things that we might do that are mutually voluntary, there's a much smaller set of things that would actually improve others' lives. It actually conduces to the good of other people. And that's a way I think you can defend yourself and you can feel proud about what you're doing, but that's not the lesson that people get. And I think the kinds of the Wolf on Wall Street sort of view is that, well, as long as somebody's willing to buy it, then you might as well sell it. No. That's exactly the problem.
But you're back to the formation question, right?
Absolutely.
Because if we're not teaching this at all and no one gets any of that, then I don't think we should expect behavior to be that much better than we're seeing, or things to work better than
It
what we're
doesn't
seeing.
spontaneous. I think that's a good point because I'm a parent. Many of you in the audience are parents also. I think many parents have this view, or maybe it's sort of the cultural view, that children will spontaneously come up with the right moral set of moral. No, that's not how it works. Children are effectively barbarians. I mean, they have to be trained. They have to be taught. There are certain things, and when they're young, there are rules. Keep your hands to yourself. If you make a promise, keep it. When you're older, okay, we can have a theory. We can have a discussion in the philosophy seminar room about, well, what actually makes this, what's the correct moral theory or something. But this is something I think a lot of people don't get at any point in their formation. This was mentioned in one of the earlier panels, but, by the time students get to me or, they get into college, a shocking number of them have never had anybody tell them things like, how do you dress appropriately to a function? I mean, that's a small thing. It's not like, the fate of Western civilization is going to depend on whether you dress appropriately. But why aren't we telling our children this is appropriate behavior and this isn't appropriate behavior? What are we afraid of exactly? I mean, it's this idea that, well, we want to be neutral, I guess, or we don't want to hurt people's feelings or something. No. I mean, maybe at some point we'll come to this question of what we have for signs of hope. But, go ahead. Yeah.
How easy, so you teach morality to business students, basically, right? How easy is that? Do you find that difficult? Or how successful are you at that?
Maybe too soon to tell.
Jim, I I didn't mean to come across like that. I'm trying to do the same thing. How successful are we at that?
It depends on, it's hard to measure,
Yeah.
but I will say this. Here's one sign. Students are absolutely hungry to have these conversations. They love having somebody, so I say to them things like, well, don't ever behave like this, what you're doing. And I don't have a problem telling students, like, you're dressed inappropriately, you need to dress differently for next time. They, thank you for telling, that's what they say, thank you for telling me. We have discussions about things like, have you heard of this phrase, work-life balance? So we have discussions about trade-offs. So trade-offs is an economic concept. We live in a world of scarcity, another economic concept. So if we live in a world of scarcity, it means we can't satisfy all our needs and desires at the same time, which means that any time we say yes to something, it means we're saying no to something else. Do these all seem like common sense to you? Well, you might be surprised what students, their sort of view of the world, where they have what I sometimes jokingly call the milk comes from the grocery store theory of economics. They don't really understand about trade-offs. But you talk about trade-offs, you talk about scarcity, and getting back to the work-life balance. Maybe you can't actually do all of the things you would like to accomplish in life at the same time. Wait, what? Okay. Now, if you can't, then that means you should start thinking about prioritizing them. When you're 100, and so here's an exercise I give all of my students. I call it the view from 120. When you're at the end of your life, imagine now you're at the end of your life, you're 120 years old, looking back on the life you led. What life do you want to have led such that at that point, you will look back on it and say, that was a life worth having been led. I wasn't just taking up space. I wasn't squandering my gifts and my blessings. It was a life worth having been led. Now, you imagine that, and let's reverse engineer. What do you need to be doing 20 years from now in order to give yourself a chance for that? 10 years from now, 5 years from now, what do you need to be doing right now? So one piece of success I think I've had is when you talk to students about things like that, suddenly this idea of prioritizing and figuring out what really matters and what doesn't really matter, it begins to clarify itself. I don't have to tell them. They start to realize, oh, yeah, there are all kinds of things that don't really matter. There are some things that really do matter.
So that's the business school side of things. Nathan, how easy is it for you to teach moral behavior, proper behavior for business to your employees? You've hired thousands of people over your time. You trained them. Was it easy? Are you creating morality in your company?
Yeah, I don't know. It's a little bit of a tricky question. I think there's just simple, basic things that we do. For instance, whenever I worked more directly with certain parts of the company, right? So I was over sales for many years before I passed that off. Just always had a policy. For instance, you just never lie at all, period, end of story, not even the tiniest bit, even when it doesn't matter. And what I mean by that is it's really easy. Let's say you have a shipment delayed and you have a big order and you have a customer, you got to tell them it's going to be 2 days late. It's not even so much that you might tell the lie because it's going to soften the blow. It could be it's just a shorter email. Like, does that make sense?
Yeah,
like,
absolutely.
it could just be it's a 2-sentence versus a 5-sentence email. You can just say, oh, sorry, it's late because blah, boom, and you just get on to the next thing. Don't even do that because it sort of creates habits that will then eventually lead to a real lie, right?
Yeah.
So things like that we would always work with. Just make sure we're always. So I think things of that nature, right? Just character, virtue. Just don't compromise on basic, moral things. And of course, we tried to always encourage staff to be supportive of each other, not have sort of a competitive atmosphere in that sense. We're all on one common mission to deliver the best thing for the customer with a good attitude, roll up your sleeves. So I think it's like blue collar stuff. It's nothing too
Not complicated.
too interesting or exciting.
And that's working?
Yeah, well, I think so. Yeah, it seems to be.
Oren, you're the one who's observing all of this and writing about it. Do you want to chime in? Because if it is really that we're educating people properly in the business schools and the individual businesses are doing well, would you still like to point anything out that's not working?
Well, I guess the one thing that I've been struck by listening to the descriptions is that there's maybe a distinction between the sort of ethical or moral dimension of how we do things versus the moral or ethical dimension of what we're doing. And I think a lot of business ethics discussions, or, as Nathan's been describing, kind of things you focus on. Well, once you're at the paper company, you've resolved the what. Now the question is, how do you do it? I think that's the currency we're most comfortable with, which is to say, wherever you are in the business world, behave ethically. And that makes sense, and I think that also feels very achievable. That is, whatever, to Jim's point about, are you selling something that actually creates value and improves the world in some way? Whatever you're selling, being an ethical salesperson, you can do. The harder question, I think, is, do we have a notion of the what? And that's why I so appreciate Jim's comment that it may be that there are some choices in what industry you go into, what you choose to sell, where you choose to locate your company, that those have an incredible ethical and moral dimension too. And those are the places where I think, especially as we think about forming young people, that we're really struggling. I think we turn out a lot of people who understand the do's and don'ts quite well. Whether or not they follow it all the time comes down to a lot of personal factors. But that broader prioritization of, okay, here's what actually matters and you are trying to accomplish, and what the point of having this market and businesses are in the first place. I think Jim's course is probably a real outlier in that respect, and something that needs just a lot more attention generally.
So you do think the sparks that he writes about are flying with the conflict between the systems and even within each system?
Well, I would love to see them flying. My concern would be that the moral cultural sphere as it is operating
not flying,
is greased.
Yeah. There's no sparks.
There's no sparks at all. It's well, that's terrific. You went and made a lot of money and.
No, I think I really like what Oren's saying about the what. I could not agree more, and also Jim. But not to be too out of my zone and geeky about this, but I actually do think it goes back a little bit to the sound money question, weirdly enough, because we have extreme low time preference, and I just think that has an impact on the what, right? Because we're just thinking, even startup culture. I saw. It's an obvious observation, but I saw a tweet from Nassim Taleb last week. It was very obvious, but it's still good to remember. Startup culture really is sort of build it, sell it to the next guy, to sell to the next guy, to sell to the next guy. That to me is somewhat of a symptom of easy money everywhere you go, and I don't think that's necessarily the natural state of what we would see in startup culture or the what if we didn't have absurd Fed policies. Yeah. Just as one.
Yeah. We looked at the issues, and there are plenty of things to correct, and Novak asks for the continuous revolution and maybe evolution of this whole system. But now within capitalism, the wheels are turning. There's a lot of proposals for the renewal and changes in capitalism. Maybe not so much what you think the outcome of it should be, but do you see signs of hope for this collaboration, for this system? And what gives you hope in this, that actually things can get better? Do you want to go first?
I'll offer one hopeful thought, which is I do think over the past maybe 5 years there has been a shift in how people evaluate essentially how things are going in America. There was such a focus, again, I would locate the start of this in the 80s, toward this consumer welfare mindset. And the goal of everything we were here to do was basically to have as much cheap stuff as we could. And we were succeeding like gangbusters on that basis. And there came to be a realization after the financial crisis in the last decade that despite everyone having bigger flat screen TVs than ever, whether it was deaths of despair, labor force dropout, family collapse, that I always use the analogy, there's the Hollywood trailer, this, 20-something woman thought she had it all. And then she realizes that she doesn't because she has the job and the car and the whatever else, but she doesn't have the family and the community and so forth. And we sort of had a collective national realization of that. And what to do about it remains obviously incredibly fraught, but I even find in sort of the right of center policy debates that I'm involved in, the argument that, oh, well, look at this economic GDP data, as you can see, things are going well, that was a slam dunk argument 10 years ago, and it's just not anymore. And so what do we do still has to be figured out, but the realization that there's more than just a free market producing stuff efficiently is, I think, with us now.
Nathan?
My sign of hope is maybe a little off topic, but it's where it's at, would be the classical school movement and more independent education. I think a lot of people are stepping up and recognizing that's a huge need, and great things are popping up at a pace that's pretty exciting.
Yep.
I'm a part of that movement, and I really believe in it. And so that, to me, is where the hope is for
Next
these problems.
generation.
Yep.
Jim?
I wouldn't have mentioned immediately the Catholic or the classical school movement, but I will second that. I think that's a great sign of hope. My wife works at a startup classical Catholic school in South Bend, Indiana, where we are, which is doing great things. And it's not the only one that's doing those kinds of great things. There are many reasons to not be hopeful about the world. And it's very easy to start listing all of the things that are terrible about the world. And I think that, too, can be a road to vice. I don't want to speak on behalf, I'll let the priests correct me in the room. But it seems to me that that can be a road to vice, is we spend a lot of time thinking about all the negative things. One sign of hope that I think is worth contemplating is when you ask, I teach at a university, so I only see a small little segment of society, and I see students for only a little sliver of their lives. I don't see all of the other things that many of you see in the world. But the moment, I teach in a business school, the moment I say something like, shouldn't your future career speak to your moral soul? They immediately light up. Immediately. It doesn't matter what party they vote for. It doesn't matter whether they go to my church or somebody else's church or no church. Immediately that speaks to them. That gives me hope. They want to have those conversations. And it's not just about, well, can I shame somebody else on Twitter or something, or be part of a Twitter mob or something. That's not what they want. They genuinely want to believe and find the thing that they're going to do that will actually be an expression of their moral identities. And that's something that does give me hope. And I think, what we have to do is respond to that. And one of the things that we professors have fallen down on that job, I think. For all sorts of reasons, we haven't tried to address students sufficiently as souls, as moral creatures. We address them as different other things. That's a different panel. But that, I think, does give me hope that they immediately respond to that question.
And this is the profoundly revealing insight of this entire system and of the appeal of this man in the first place, because he's not an economist, he's not a business strategy guy, he's not a politician, he's a theologian. And I think that points in the direction of where the answers lie. Oren, Nathan, Jim, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Just want to thank the panelists once again. We've just had some really great dynamic panels today, but what seems to be becoming increasingly apparent is that of the three pillars or the three dimensions of Novak's system, the moral, religious, cultural pillar, the one that seems sometimes to be the most abstruse to business people, almost naturally seems to come up again and again. Not only is the one that that shouldn't be forgotten, is coming up again and again as the one that's primary in our culture, in our fragmented culture, in our culture that seems to be losing its sense of family, its sense of values. The first thing we have to do, even as business people, is to think about morals, is to think about conscience, following our conscience, to think about giving some time over to forming our conscience, to doing something that's going to make a difference. And as Jim was saying, the students gravitate toward this. They really they want to bring that out in themselves. And I just get such encouragement here because in my own thinking, I do think that bringing out moral dimensions of business and moral dimensions, period, to just young people is becoming actually somewhat fashionable, so long as you put it in the right ways. You can't diss somebody, but the idea, though, is the discussion of morality is important, and I just think you have proven this by just naturally gravitating, all of you, toward this third pillar as the one that's going to rescue not only economics, but politics in our country. And God knows that if we don't take something to turn for the moral and religious dimension of our lives, we're not going to have much left. So thank you so much for that very, very enlightening discussion.